It was a bitterly cold night in upstate New York, and I had just finished a long and exhausting drive. I'd been meaning to take a break for some time, so I booked an Airbnb just outside of the city in a small, quiet town, perfect for some peace and solitude. The place was a small, old house tucked away on the edge of a forest. There was something charming about it: tall trees surrounding the property, a creaky wooden porch, and just enough isolation to feel like I was escaping from everything. I felt a slight thrill as I stepped inside, almost as if I had stumbled upon a secret hideaway. The host had already left the key in the lockbox, so I let myself in. The house smelled old but not unpleasant, like a mixture of dust and aged wood. I immediately felt the absence of any noise, which was oddly comforting. After a long drive, all I wanted was to relax and unwind, so I dropped my bag on the couch and made myself a cup of tea. The house was modest but cozy, perfect for a night alone. By the time I finished my tea, the sun had set, and the house was completely bathed in the shadows of dusk. I turned on the lamps, but the light still couldn't seem to chase away the darkness that crept into the corners of the room. I was alone, and the silence felt almost oppressive, but I brushed it off. Maybe I was just tired. I was in the middle of unpacking when I heard it, a soft thump coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was distinct enough to make me pause. The sound had a rhythm, almost like footsteps, but surely that couldn't be possible. The host had said she'd already left for the weekend, and I was the only guest. Still, I tried to convince myself that it was just the house settling. Old buildings make noises after all. But then I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer. I stood frozen in place, listening. There was no one else here. I should have checked, but something about the silence made it hard to move. My mind began to race. Was I being paranoid? My phone was sitting on the counter, so I picked it up to distract myself, hoping it would calm my nerves. I opened Instagram, scrolling mindlessly through posts, trying to ignore the sound that seemed to be getting closer. And then a message popped up on my screen. It was from an unknown number. "You're in my house." I felt a chill run through me. I froze, staring at the message, trying to make sense of it. It couldn't be real. The message didn't make any sense. Was it a prank? Someone trying to mess with me? I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. But that was when the footsteps upstairs began again. This time they were much louder, unmistakable, and clearly coming closer. A door creaked open, followed by the sound of something dragging across the floor, like furniture being shifted. I could feel my pulse quicken. The sound was so vivid, so real. There was no way it was just my imagination. I glanced at my phone again. The same number had sent another message. "Come upstairs." I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I had to know what was happening. I stood up slowly, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The footsteps above me stopped abruptly. That's when I noticed it. The curtains were swaying ever so slightly, despite there being no breeze. My heart raced as I approached the window, my fingers brushing the cold glass. Through the darkness, I could just make out a figure standing on the porch. It was hard to see, but there was someone there, just standing still, watching. I pulled away from the window, my breath shallow. I couldn't understand what was happening. Was someone outside? Had someone snuck into the house? I felt sick to my stomach. My first instinct was to call the police, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The phone in my hand felt heavy. Just then, a loud knock echoed from the front door. I gasped and rushed to it, looking through the peephole. But there was nothing there, no one at all. Just empty space. I stepped back from the door, panic rising in my chest. How could that be? The phone in my hand buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "Look behind you." I spun around, my heart pounding in my throat. My eyes landed on the reflection in the mirror hanging on the wall. The image was distorted by the dim light, but there, in the corner of the reflection, was a face, pale with wide, hollow eyes. I screamed, stumbling backward. The face was gone the moment I looked away, leaving only the cold air in its wake. My mind was reeling, spinning in terror. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my things and ran to the front door, but as I turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. I was locked in. My phone buzzed once more. Don't try to leave. My fingers fumbled for the door key, and in a panic, I tried to unlock it. The door suddenly flung open and I tumbled out onto the porch. My mind was in a blur and I barely registered the sudden flash of headlights in the distance. A car had pulled up to the house. I ran down the driveway away from the house, my chest burning with fear. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. I didn't even look back. I didn't want to know what had been waiting for me in that house. The police came shortly after, but they found nothing, no trace of anyone who had been in the house. The place was eerily empty. My phone had no messages and the unknown number was gone. That was weeks ago, and I still can't shake the feeling that something was watching me that night. That someone was waiting just outside my reach. And even now, sometimes when I walk past windows, I can't help but feel the weight of eyes following me. But I don't know who or what they belong to. All I know is I'll never be staying in another Airbnb again. I had just moved to Chicago a few weeks ago, fresh from college, starting a new job in a marketing firm. It was a decent job and the city was everything I'd hoped for, vibrant, full of energy and always bustling. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment in an old building downtown. It was the kind of place you could tell had a history, with its creaky wooden floors and narrow hallways. Despite its age, the rent was cheap, and the location was perfect for someone who worked in the heart of the city. Everything seemed fine at first. I worked long hours, and by the time I got back to the apartment each night, it was already late, sometimes past midnight. On one of those nights, I returned to my apartment after a particularly grueling day. The building was unusually quiet, even for that time. No music, no voices from the other tenants. The only sound was the distant hum of the city below. I lived on the 4th floor, and as usual, I took the stairs to avoid the elevator. When I reached the landing and turned to go down the hall to my apartment, I thought I heard something, footsteps. But when I paused and looked down the hall, no one was there. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I shrugged it off, convinced it was just my imagination. But then it happened again. The next night, as I was walking down the same hallway, I heard the same soft, shuffling steps behind me. I turned around, half expecting to see someone there. But there was no one. The hall was empty as it had been the night before. This time, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My heart rate quickened and I rushed to my apartment. As the days passed, the strange occurrences escalated. At first, it was the footsteps, always behind me, never seen. Then came the sounds of faint tapping on my apartment door in the middle of the night. Soft, like someone was gently knocking, but when I opened the door, nothing. No one. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just an empty hallway, the dim light from the overhead fixture flickering. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the old building settling. Maybe a neighbor was just a little more clumsy than usual. But then things started to get stranger. One evening, after getting home late from work, I noticed my phone had a notification from my tracking app, Life 360. It was a location sharing app that my family had set up for safety reasons. They could see where I was and I could see them. But the notification wasn't from any of my family members. It was a new notification. Someone had been tracking me right outside my apartment. My breath caught in my throat. I opened the app and checked the live location. There, on the map, was a little dot moving around the block. It was close. Very close. I stared at the map for what felt like an eternity. Then, in a flash of panic, I grabbed my phone and called the police. But as soon as I dialed, my phone froze. The screen went blank and I could feel my heart beating in my ears. The silence in my apartment was suffocating. I stood frozen, unable to move when I heard it again. Soft, measured footsteps coming closer to my door. I turned off all the lights, hoping the darkness would keep me hidden. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. My pulse thudded in my chest. They were right outside my door now. I held my breath and prayed they wouldn't knock. But then, the worst sound I could imagine echoed through the apartment. Soft knocking, slow and deliberate, on my door. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just listened. The knocking continued for what felt like forever. I grabbed a kitchen knife, trembling, and slowly inched toward the door, my heart pounding in my throat. I reached for the door handle, but before I could turn it, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. A whisper. "Open the door." I froze, unable to breathe. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced. Who was this? What did they want? Why were they doing this? I didn't open the door. Instead, I backed away from it, trying to keep my voice steady enough to call 911. But again, my phone didn't work. It wouldn't turn on. The screen stayed black. The knocking grew more frantic now, slamming against the door. The handle jiggled violently, and I realized the person was trying to get in. I had no choice. I grabbed my coat, and without thinking, I bolted out of my apartment. I ran down the stairs faster than I ever had in my life. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. When I finally reached the street, I collapsed on a bench and pulled out my phone. I was shaking uncontrollably. My heart was still racing. I dialed 911 again, and this time the call went through. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. They checked the building and my apartment, but there was no sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone at all. They told me it was probably just a prank or a misunderstanding. But as I walked back up to my apartment with the officers, I noticed something strange. The floor where my apartment door was located, there were wet, muddy footprints leading toward my door. The officers didn't notice, but I did. They searched the building but found nothing. They couldn't explain it. I don't know what happened that night, but I haven't felt safe in that apartment since. I moved out the next month. The building remains empty now, they say. At least that's what they tell me. But I still wonder even now what really happened that night. Was it a person or something else? Maybe I'll never know. But one thing is certain. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. And whatever it was still out there. I had always enjoyed the solitude of late-night travel. There's something about the quiet hours when most people are asleep, empty stations, dim lights, and a sense of anonymity. But this time it was different. It was just after midnight when I stepped off the train at the small, isolated station in a sleepy town on the outskirts of Cleveland. The only reason I was there was because of a mix-up with my travel schedule. My connecting train was delayed, and the next one wouldn't leave until the early morning. So, I was stuck at this forgotten station in the middle of nowhere, with nothing around except a few vending machines and a half-lit platform. I had no choice but to wait. The place looked like something straight out of a horror movie. The platform stretched out into the dark, the lights flickering sporadically, casting long, eerie shadows. I checked the time on my phone, still over an hour before the next train. I decided to sit near the far end of the station, where there was a single bench beneath a flickering fluorescent light. The hum of the station was deafening in its silence. I tried to distract myself with my phone, scrolling through messages and mindlessly checking social media. But the longer I sat there, the more I started to feel like something wasn't right. The place was empty, or at least it seemed to be. But every time I looked up from my phone, I swore I saw movement, just out of the corner of my eye. A shadow passing by the platform. A figure standing in the dark at the far end. I'd blink and look again, and the figure would be gone, leaving nothing but the empty stretch of concrete. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. It was late, I was tired, and this station was probably just creeping me out. But the unease kept building. I glanced at the exit. The doors were locked. There was no sign of any station staff, and the ticket booth had long since closed. I thought about calling a cab to take me to a nearby hotel, but just as I was about to pull up the app on my phone, I heard footsteps. slow, deliberate, like someone was walking toward me. I froze. The footsteps were soft, almost too quiet to hear, but they grew louder with each passing second. I looked around, expecting to see someone coming down the stairs from the street level or the platform, but the place was still empty. The footsteps didn't stop. They just kept coming closer in a straight line, headed directly toward me. My heart began to race. I stood up, looking around nervously. There was nowhere to hide. The station was small, just a few benches and the vending machines, and the only other exit was locked. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. My phone was dead. Great. Just great. The footsteps stopped, right at the far end of the platform. I waited, listening intently. No more sounds. But then I heard a door creak open. The old maintenance door at the far end of the station, the one that had been closed when I first entered. I hadn't seen anyone come through it. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but something in my gut told me otherwise. I took a deep breath and walked toward the maintenance door, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I got closer, I could see that the door was ajar just slightly. A small crack. A gust of cold air slipped through the gap. I pushed it open, half expecting to find some staff member or maybe just some other late-night traveler. But there was nothing. The room behind the door was completely dark, the air stale, and the only thing I could hear was the faint hum of the lights above. I stepped inside, my senses alert. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I looked around the empty space. That's when I heard it. A voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. You shouldn't be here. I froze, the blood draining from my face. I whirled around, but there was no one there. My mind raced. My heart hammered in my chest. I could feel my hands shaking as I fumbled for the door to leave. But the door, it wouldn't open. It was stuck. The whispering voice came again, this time from behind me, closer than before. Leave now. I finally managed to yank the door open, stumbling back into the main station. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked around, desperate for any sign of life. The station was still eerily empty, but I could feel eyes on me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was watching me. I bolted for the exit, and this time the door to the street was open. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, gasping for breath. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. No one. The sound of the train finally arriving broke the silence. I hurried toward it, practically running, and as I stepped onto the platform, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still out there just beyond the shadows. The train ride felt endless. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that someone had followed me, that the strange voice would come again. It wasn't until I reached my final destination, exhausted and on edge, that I allowed myself to breathe easier. But I'll never forget that station. I'll never forget the whisper in the dark. I don't know who or what it was, but one thing is certain. I will never take a late-night train stop again. And I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe alone at a station again. The worst part? I checked the schedule later that night. The next train was supposed to leave in less than 10 minutes. But according to the station's records, no trains had come or gone from there that night. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, a break from the chaos of city life. My friends and I had rented an old lodge tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains. The location seemed perfect, far from the usual hustle and bustle, surrounded by towering trees and distant, jagged peaks. We were looking forward to hiking, cooking together, and just enjoying the serenity. We had no idea that the weekend would quickly turn into something we'd never forget. We arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. The air was cool, crisp, and filled with the scent of pine. The lodge itself was a rustic two-story building with an old stone fireplace and wooden beams. It had all the charm of a place lost in time, but there was something off about it, something we couldn't quite put our finger on. The moment we stepped inside, it felt like we were in a forgotten world. The place was cold, almost unnaturally so, even though the weather was fine outside. We shrugged it off. The heating system was probably just old, we thought. But as we unpacked, I noticed something strange. There were no other cars in the parking lot, just ours. I figured the place might be isolated, but it seemed odd that we wouldn't have seen another vehicle driving up the narrow road. That night, as we were eating dinner around the old wooden table, the power flickered. It was brief, but enough to make the lights buzz and then go out completely. We stumbled around, lighting candles and trying to get the generator to work. While we were fumbling with the flashlight, we heard a sound, a faint, distant thud. It wasn't from the house, but from somewhere nearby in the woods. Probably just a tree falling, one of my friends said, dismissing it. But another friend, Sarah, seemed more concerned. She had a nervous look on her face and kept glancing toward the dark windows. Maybe it's an animal, she suggested, but there was doubt in her voice. We tried to enjoy the rest of the evening, but the unsettling feeling lingered. After a while, we all headed to bed. The rooms were small, simple, nothing fancy. I had the room closest to the stairs, and as I lay there listening to the wind outside, I began to drift off. Then, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it, a tapping, light, almost rhythmic. It came from somewhere downstairs. It wasn't like normal house noises. This sounded deliberate, as if someone was trying to get in. I lay still, my heart beginning to race. Maybe it was one of the other guys playing a prank. But when I checked the time, it was well past midnight and the noise kept going. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to confront whatever it was. I closed my eyes, tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't stop. Finally, I grabbed my phone and texted my friend, Tom, asking if he had heard the tapping too. A few moments later, his response came, "Yeah, I heard it. I thought it was just the wind at first, but now it sounds like it's coming from the back door." I felt my blood run cold. There was no back door to the lodge. At least, none that we could see from the inside. With trembling hands, I texted the others, asking them to come downstairs. When they arrived, we all stood there in the dark, listening intently. The tapping continued, echoing in the silence. We couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but it seemed to be growing louder. I suggested we check outside. Tom, being the brave one, grabbed a flashlight, and we cautiously stepped outside into the cold, moonless night. The area around the lodge was shrouded in thick trees and darkness, but we saw nothing. No signs of movement, no footprints. Just the thick, oppressive silence of the mountains. But the tapping continued, this time louder and much closer, as if it was coming from inside the lodge. We rushed back inside, locking all the doors and checking every window. The place felt even colder now, almost as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. The fireplace, which had been warm earlier, was now stone cold. We huddled together in the living room, staring at the flickering candles, the noise outside growing louder. Suddenly there was a loud bang, a sharp, forceful sound, followed by an eerie silence. We rushed to the door, but when we opened it, we saw something that none of us could explain. In the yard, under the dim light from the windows, were fresh footprints, leading from the tree line toward the lodge and stopping right at the edge of the porch. The footprints weren't from any animal we recognized. They were too large and too human, and they were fresh. No one had been outside, yet the prints were clear and undeniable. We quickly bolted the door and backed away from the windows. Panic began to spread among us. The place, once charming, now felt like a trap. We searched the rooms, double-checking that all the windows were locked and secured. The tapping returned, this time much louder, as if someone was knocking on the back door. Tom, trying to keep calm, suggested we call the police, but as soon as he reached for his phone, it died, completely. We couldn't explain it. The lodge was secluded, but there was no reason our phones should have lost signal. In a last-ditch effort, we packed up whatever we could and prepared to leave. But just as we reached the door, something caught my eye. A shadow moved across the window, too tall to be a tree. Someone or something was standing just outside. Before we could react, the power came back on, the lights flickering once more. It felt like a sign, like something was giving us one last chance to escape. We didn't look back. We ran. We drove down the narrow, winding road and didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. To this day, I can't explain what happened at that lodge. The footprints? The tapping? We never found out who or what was out there in the dark. The police, when they eventually investigated, found nothing unusual. The lodge is still there, abandoned, and I hear rumors that people who stay there sometimes hear strange noises in the night. But I'll never go back. Whatever was out there, it's better left undisturbed. It was supposed to be a simple road trip to visit my family upstate, just a few hours of driving through the wintry landscape of upstate New York. But what started as a normal journey quickly turned into something terrifying. The day had started out clear, the roads dry, and everything seemed perfect for a long drive. I'd left my apartment in Brooklyn around noon, hoping to beat the rush of traffic. The sun was high in the sky, and though it was cold, the weather report had promised no snow. But by the time I reached the outskirts of the Catskills, something had changed. The snow started falling gently at first, just a light dusting that coated the road and made everything look picturesque. I kept driving, enjoying the quiet, the soft hum of my car's engine, and the isolation that only a long road trip can provide. But soon enough, the snowfall picked up. Visibility started to decline and the roads became slick. I figured it was no big deal. The GPS said I still had about 90 miles to go, and I knew a small town was coming up soon. I'd stop there, grab some coffee, and stretch my legs. I wasn't worried. After all, it wasn't a blizzard, just a heavy snowstorm. But when I reached the small town, the place seemed abandoned. The streets were eerily empty. Even the gas stations and stores were shut down, their windows dark. The snow continued to fall, heavier now, blanketing the road with a thick layer of ice and snow. I stopped at a gas station just on the edge of town to check the weather. My phone, as usual, was playing tricks on me. No service. It hadn't occurred to me earlier, but now it felt like something was off. I walked around the gas station for a few minutes, trying to stretch my legs, and noticed a small sign that read, "Winter Road Advisory, road closed up ahead." I hadn't planned on taking any detours. My route was straightforward, or at least it was supposed to be. I got back in my car, cranked the heat, and told myself I would power through. That's when I saw it, the barrier. A large, orange roadblock was placed across the main highway. The kind you see when they're doing construction or there's an accident. But there were no workers, no vehicles, just an empty stretch of road beyond the barrier, leading into what looked like an endless snowstorm. I stopped and sat there for a while, staring at the snowflakes swirling through the air. There were no signs telling me if I could take an alternative route, and it didn't make sense for the road to be closed this far out of town. I could see tracks in the snow where someone else had driven through, but the snow was falling so quickly that it seemed to erase the road in front of me. After what felt like hours, I finally decided to try and drive past the roadblock. It was risky, but I didn't have many options. The last thing I wanted to do was turn back and get stuck in the snow with no service and no help nearby. I carefully maneuvered my car around the barrier and started driving. The road was empty, quiet, and the snow continued to fall in thick, swirling sheets. The only sound was the crunch of my tires against the packed snow. It didn't take long for me to start feeling uneasy. The landscape felt too desolate. No other cars, no other travelers. Just the barren stretch of road with the trees on either side, their limbs heavy with snow. I tried to distract myself, focusing on the road ahead, but every now and then, I'd glance into the rearview mirror. There was no one behind me. It was just me in that endless white world. As I drove on, I noticed something strange. In the distance, up ahead, there was a figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or some animal standing in the snow. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. I slowed down, my heart rate picking up. The figure didn't move. It was a man dressed in a thick, dark coat, standing still in the middle of the road with his back to me. I honked my horn trying to alert him, but he didn't respond. I slowed even further, ready to swerve out of the way if he moved, but he just stayed there, frozen. I stopped about 10 feet from him. I was scared, confused, unsure of what to do. I couldn't even tell if he was alive. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the shape of his body outlined against the snow. His hair, if he had any, was completely covered by a thick hood. I honked again. Nothing. He didn't even flinch. I made the decision to get out of the car. I needed to see if he was okay or if he was in trouble. I couldn't leave him out there in the snow. As I opened the door, the cold air hit me like a slap, and I quickly shut the door behind me. I hesitated for a moment before stepping onto the snow-covered road, walking cautiously toward the man. My footsteps felt deafening in the silence of the storm. When I was just a few feet away, he suddenly turned around, his head snapping to face me with an eerie speed. His face was pale, covered with snow, his eyes wide and unblinking, and his mouth was hanging open as if he were trying to speak but couldn't. I froze. And then, without a word, he turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing between the trees as if he were part of the storm itself. My breath caught in my chest. I ran back to the car, slamming the door behind me and speeding off, not daring to look back. I finally made it back to the main highway, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I passed the spot where I had seen the man, the snow had already erased his footprints, and the road looked as if nothing had ever happened. By the time I reached my family's house, I was exhausted, shaken, and grateful to be off that snowbound road. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I wasn't sure they would believe me, but I'll never forget that feeling. The man in the snow, the eerie silence, and the terrifying certainty that something wasn't right. And the strangest part? I later found out that no one had been reported missing from the area. The police had no record of any roadblocks, no accidents. It was as if that stretch of road and the man standing there had been swallowed by the snow itself. I don't know what happened that night, but I've never driven through those mountains again. It was my first year at college, and I was adjusting to dorm life in the heart of Chicago. The bustling city felt a world apart from the quiet suburbs I grew up in. My dorm room was small, cramped, but cozy enough for a freshman living alone. It had a single window that overlooked the courtyard, and though I didn't have the best view, it was peaceful. I liked the calm in the mornings, the slow sunrise that filtered through the blinds. Things were going well for the first few weeks. Classes were busy but manageable. I was getting to know my roommates and making new friends, the typical college experience. But then, one evening in October, things started to feel off. It was a Friday and my roommates had gone out to a party. I'd opted to stay in, preferring a quiet night of reading and watching Netflix. As the night drew on, I heard the usual sounds, people chatting in the hall, the occasional slam of a door. But then, around midnight, I heard something different. At first, it was just a faint tapping sound. It was subtle, but it stood out in the stillness of the dorm. It came from the direction of my window, which was a little weird since the blinds were closed. I thought maybe the wind was causing something to knock against the glass, so I shrugged it off. But then the tapping turned into a soft scratching noise. It was so quiet, I almost wasn't sure I'd heard it. My curiosity got the better of me, so I got up and pulled back the blinds, just enough to peer out into the courtyard. At first, I saw nothing, just the usual empty benches and trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then, my eyes caught movement in the corner of the courtyard, near the old, dimly lit bench where no one ever sat. There was a figure, a man standing still. He was too far away to see clearly, but something about the way he was standing struck me as wrong. He wasn't moving, just staring at the dorm building. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My first instinct was to think it was just some guy loitering, but there was a strange unease in the pit of my stomach. Why was he standing so still at this hour? And why was he staring up at my window? I tried to shake it off. I mean, it could have been nothing, just someone waiting for a friend or maybe a student out for a late night smoke. But I couldn't stop glancing at him every few minutes. He hadn't moved, not at all. My heartbeat quickened. I decided to call my friend Emily, who lived on the floor above me. She picked up after a few rings, sounding groggy. "What's up?" she asked. "Hey, I think there's someone outside my window," I said, trying to sound casual but feeling my voice tremble. "I don't know, it's probably nothing, but they're just standing there. It's freaking me out." "That's weird," she replied. "Maybe you should call campus security just to be safe." I agreed, and before I knew it, I was on the phone with campus security. They told me to stay inside, lock the door, and wait until they could send someone to check it out. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but something told me this wasn't just a random person. I hung up the phone, still staring at the figure below. He hadn't moved. My anxiety kept building until I couldn't take it anymore. I backed away from the window and locked it tightly. But just as I turned around to sit back down on my bed, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of scratching. This time it was coming from my window, on the inside. I froze. My heart raced. I turned back around, and my mind was scrambling to make sense of what was happening. The window was locked, the blinds were still drawn, and yet something was scraping against the glass from the inside. I took a cautious step toward the window, slowly reaching for the blinds. As I pulled them back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, just inches from my face on the inside of the glass, was a fingerprint, a handprint. But it was smeared as if someone had pressed their fingers against the window and dragged them down. I backed away, my head spinning. There was no one in my room. There had been no one in the hall. I was alone. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and texted Emily, telling her what had just happened. I locked the door again and paced around the room. I couldn't think straight. There was no logical explanation. My mind raced through all the possible scenarios. Could someone have gotten in without me noticing? Then a new thought struck me. The man outside. Was he still there? I didn't want to look. I was afraid of what I might see. But my curiosity and my fear compelled me to peek out the window once again. I opened the blinds, this time cautiously, and looked down. He was still there. But now he wasn't just standing still. He was staring directly at me. I gasped and stumbled back. His face was pale, his expression blank and emotionless. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He just stared up at my window like he knew I was watching him. Before I could react, there was a loud knock on my door. My heart leaped in my chest, and I quickly ran to open it, half expecting it to be someone I knew. But when I opened it, no one was there. Just a small folded piece of paper left on the ground. I bent down and picked it up. My hands shook as I unfolded it. It read, "I see you." At that moment, everything inside me screamed to leave. I ran downstairs and out of the building, barely thinking. I found Emily and some other friends in the common area, and I told them everything. They assured me I wasn't imagining things, but none of us knew who the man was or what he wanted. Campus security never found him. They combed the area around the dorm, but there was no trace of the man, not even footprints in the snow outside. The strangest part was no one else had seen him. No one had heard anything. The police were called, but they found nothing. The security footage around the dorm was mysteriously missing. After that night, I never felt safe again in that dorm. No one could explain what happened, but it left me with a deep sense of unease. Whoever, or whatever, was watching me that night had disappeared without a trace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there somewhere. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a quick trip to a remote island off the coast of Maine. A chance to escape the noise of the city, disconnect from everything, and just relax. My friends and I had booked the place months in advance, eager to enjoy some peace and quiet. But when we finally arrived, I realized this trip would be anything but peaceful. The island was small, only accessible by a small boat that could only accommodate a handful of passengers. It was known for its tranquility and isolation, and we thought it would be the perfect spot for some much-needed downtime. The cottages were rustic, surrounded by dense forest, and the view of the ocean was beautiful. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon. The air was cool and the waves crashed softly against the rocky shore. It felt almost magical, like something out of a storybook. There was one small inn on the island, which looked abandoned except for a single light flickering from the second-floor window. The innkeeper, an elderly man, greeted us with a smile but said little. He handed us the keys to our cottage and quickly disappeared inside. Our group was made up of 5 friends, including me. We didn't know what to expect, but we were excited. After settling into the cottage, we decided to go for a walk along the shore. The beach was deserted, save for the occasional seagull. As the night grew darker, we noticed something strange. The innkeeper was still standing in the window, staring out at us, his expression unreadable. "Isn't that a little odd?" I asked, pointing at the window. "Maybe he's just lonely," my friend Sarah replied, shrugging it off. "It's probably just his way of keeping watch over the island." But it didn't sit right with me. Why would someone just stand there, staring into the night like that? I tried to forget about it, but the feeling of unease lingered. That night, after dinner, we gathered in the living room of the cottage. It was warm inside, but the wind outside howled, rattling the windows. The isolation of the island began to feel oppressive. We turned on the TV, but the signal was fuzzy, so we decided to play cards instead. The only sounds in the room were the shuffling of cards and the occasional laugh. It was relaxing at first, but then we heard it. A faint scratching sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the noise was coming from outside the cottage. It was rhythmic, like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. We all fell silent, straining to hear. Then the sound stopped, followed by a loud thump against the side of the house. "What was that?" John asked, his voice low. "Probably just an animal," Sarah said, though her voice didn't sound as confident as before. But I didn't believe it. I stood up and moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. I saw nothing. The area was pitch dark, the only light coming from the cottage's porch. I didn't see any animals or movement, just the faint outline of trees. I felt uneasy, so I closed the curtains and tried to shake it off. The others didn't seem as concerned, but I couldn't get the feeling out of my head. We decided to turn in for the night, hoping the strange noises were just a figment of our imaginations. But as soon as I lay down, I heard it again. The scratching. It was closer now. I could hear it against the walls of the cottage, right outside my window. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise didn't stop. It went on and on, as though something, or someone, was trying to get inside. I tried to wake up the others, but the words wouldn't come out. I was frozen, too scared to move or speak. Then, suddenly, the scratching stopped. I waited, listening for any other sounds. The silence was suffocating. And then a faint whispering, low and unintelligible. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the door. My hands were shaking as I tried to unlock it, but it wouldn't budge. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing but darkness. I felt a chill run through me as the whispering grew louder, closer. Then, without warning, the door rattled violently, as though something, or someone, was trying to break in. I screamed for help, and finally the others woke up. Sarah and John rushed to the door, trying to pull it open. But it wouldn't move. The rattling grew more intense, and the whispering became clearer, as though someone was saying my name. "Emily, Emily." I couldn't breathe. The air felt heavy, as though it was pressing down on me from all sides. The door finally gave way, and we bolted out of the cottage. We ran through the darkened yard toward the shoreline, our hearts pounding, the sound of footsteps echoing behind us. When we reached the water, we stopped to catch our breath. I looked back at the cottage. The door was wide open, and standing in the doorway was the innkeeper, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes locked on me. He didn't move. He just stared. We ran back to the inn, pounding on the door until the innkeeper appeared. He was calm, almost disturbingly so, and insisted that nothing was wrong. "It's just the wind," he said, his voice low and soothing. But his eyes didn't match his words. They were cold, calculating. We left the island the next morning, our weekend ruined. The boat ride back to the mainland was long and silent, and as we looked out over the ocean, none of us spoke about what had happened. I don't know who or what was on that island, but I know one thing for sure: we weren't alone. It was a night like any other in the city. The kind of night where the streets are just quiet enough for you to hear your thoughts, but busy enough to remind you that you're never truly alone. I had just finished my shift at a downtown bar in Chicago, and it was nearly 2 a.m. when I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The cold hit me like a slap, and I tugged my jacket tighter around my body. The thought of walking back home was unbearable. I lived in a small apartment on the other side of town, and at this hour, the last thing I wanted to do was trek through empty streets. I needed a taxi. The city's taxi service was spotty at best after midnight, but after a few minutes of waiting, one pulled up. It was a beat-up yellow cab, the kind that had seen better days, but at that moment, I didn't care. I just wanted to get home. The driver, an older man, didn't say much as I climbed in. He had graying hair and a weathered face, his eyes tired but sharp. I tossed him my address and we drove off, merging with the thin stream of traffic that slithered through the city streets. For the first few minutes, it was just the hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of the street lights. But then I noticed something strange. Every time we stopped at a red light, the driver would look at me in the rearview mirror for just a little too long. Not a casual glance, but a stare. It was subtle at first and I tried to dismiss it. Maybe he was just tired, or maybe I was being paranoid after a long night at work. But it kept happening. Each time we hit a light, I would see his reflection in the mirror, his eyes locked on mine, his gaze just a little too intense. It wasn't like he was angry, but it was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite explain. I tried to distract myself by looking out the window, but the cityscape seemed to blur into a dark smear of neon and shadow. Then the silence started to feel thicker. I could hear the faint sound of the radio, but it was so quiet I had to strain to hear it. It was some talk show, and the host's voice was calming, almost soothing. But there was something off about the whole situation. I kept catching myself glancing at the driver in the mirror, but whenever I did, he would quickly look away, as if he knew I was watching him. The tension between us grew thicker with every mile. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, wanting to ask him if everything was all right, but something told me that might make the situation worse. I kept thinking about the bars I'd passed, the people inside, the warmth of the lights spilling out onto the street. I felt so far from that now. Finally, the driver broke the silence. "Where do you live again?" he asked. I was taken aback. "What?" I stammered. "Your address," he repeated, his voice colder this time. "Where do you live?" I felt my stomach drop. My heart rate picked up and I looked at him through the rearview mirror. His face seemed even more worn now, like someone who hadn't slept in days, his eyes sunken and tired. The question felt wrong. I had already given him my address when I got in the cab. "It's the same address I gave you when I got in," I said, trying to stay calm. "The same as before. I live on River Street." But there was a pause, a long, strange moment where he didn't respond. The city lights outside seemed to flicker, casting strange shadows on the cab's interior. His hands gripped the steering wheel just a little too tightly, and for a second I thought I saw him tense up as though he was about to say something, but didn't. "You're sure?" he asked finally. "You sure that's where you live?" I didn't know how to respond. The question felt so odd, so specific, but at the same time so detached. Like it didn't matter where I lived, but that he needed to confirm it for some reason. "Yes, I'm sure," I replied, trying to sound firm. "Why are you asking me that?" The silence stretched out again. My pulse raced as I stared at the back of his head, trying to figure out what was happening. The cab turned down a side street, one I didn't recognize, and I suddenly realized that we were not headed in the direction of my apartment. "Hey," I said, my voice a little shaky now. "This isn't the right way. You're taking me in the wrong direction." The driver didn't respond. He just kept driving as if he hadn't heard me. The streets were getting darker, quieter. I could see fewer and fewer cars around us, and the buildings seemed to loom closer, tighter. I didn't know where we were anymore, and panic started to rise in my chest. My phone was still in my pocket, but I hadn't taken it out. I was frozen in place, watching the city melt away behind me. I swallowed hard, then pressed the button to roll down the window. The fresh air hit my face like a slap. "Stop the car," I shouted, but the driver didn't react. Instead, the radio crackled and a voice came through. But it wasn't the host from before. It was a different voice, distorted and garbled. "Where are you going?" the voice asked. I froze. It sounded like it was coming from the radio, but it felt like it was coming from everywhere, surrounding me. The car came to a sudden halt, and before I could speak, I turned and saw the driver looking at me through the mirror, his face expressionless. I could barely breathe. His eyes held no warmth, no emotion, just cold, dead silence. "Get out," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The moment the door swung open, I jumped out without thinking. I didn't even look back as I ran, my feet pounding against the cold pavement. I didn't stop until I found a bus stop and could finally catch my breath. When I tried to report the incident to the police, the taxi company had no record of any trip matching mine that night. There was no sign of the driver, and no one had seen the car. I don't know if it was a bad dream or something else entirely, but to this day, I have never taken a late-night cab ride again. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that distorted voice. "Where are you going?" I never thought a camping trip could go so wrong. It was supposed to be a simple weekend escape from the chaos of everyday life. A chance to disconnect, enjoy nature, and reset. A few friends and I decided to camp in the Appalachian Mountains, an area known for its beauty and rugged terrain. We chose a remote spot, far away from the usual crowds, for the ultimate solitude. But as the hours passed, something shifted. What started as a peaceful retreat quickly turned into a nightmare. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sky clear and bright. The air was crisp, and the trees towered above us in every direction. Our campsite was near a small, bubbling stream, nestled deep within the woods. It was picturesque, peaceful, everything you imagine when you think of the perfect getaway. We set up tents, built a campfire, and settled in for the evening with a few beers and stories. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest around us seemed to come alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. The crackling fire and the chirping of crickets were comforting, wrapping the night in a blanket of tranquility. We joked and laughed, but as the hours passed, the mood began to shift. Around midnight, we noticed something strange. A rustling sound, faint but distinct, came from the trees behind our campsite. It wasn't the usual sounds of animals foraging. This was different, too deliberate. We all paused, glancing nervously at each other. It could have been anything, but the longer it went on, the more unsettling it became. "Probably just some deer or a raccoon," Mike, one of my friends, said, trying to brush off the tension. But I wasn't convinced. The sound continued for a few minutes, almost circling our camp before fading into the night. We all tried to laugh it off, but no one spoke much after that. The fire crackled in the silence, its warmth now feeling insufficient against the chill creeping in from the dark. At some point, I decided to take a walk to stretch my legs. I wasn't particularly scared, but the rest of the group was starting to feel antsy, so I needed some space. I told them I'd be back in 10 minutes and set off down the trail that led deeper into the woods. The trail was narrow, the trees pressing in around me, casting long shadows in the dim light of my flashlight. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned around, the trail behind me seemed darker, the trees more oppressive. I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, I was out in the middle of nowhere, and my mind was bound to play tricks on me. But then I heard it, a voice. Faint at first, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "Help, help me." I froze. My blood ran cold. The voice didn't sound like any animal, and it certainly didn't sound like one of my friends. It was a human voice, a pleading, desperate cry. I took a few hesitant steps forward, trying to locate the source of the sound. The voice came again, closer now. My breath caught in my throat, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I swung it back and forth through the dark. Nothing. The air seemed to get heavier, and the forest felt unnaturally still. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just an eerie, suffocating silence. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I turned to run back to camp, but my feet felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding me in place. Then the voice came again, this time from directly behind me. "Help me, please, he's coming." I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. Just trees and shadows. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I needed to get back to the campsite. No. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail was longer than I remembered, and with each step, the silence grew more oppressive. The trees seemed to press in on me like they were closing in, blocking my escape. Every time I glanced behind, I felt like something was there, following me. Finally, I burst into the clearing where our campsite was. The fire was still burning, but the others were nowhere to be found. My stomach dropped. "Guys?" I called out, my voice shaking. Nothing. The woods were still. Too still. I rushed to the tents, checking each one. Empty. I searched the area, my eyes darting through the darkness. There were no signs of my friends. I thought I might be losing my mind. Maybe they'd gone for a walk too, or maybe they were playing some prank on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I heard a noise again, rustling from the trees, faint but unmistakable. I turned sharply, pointing my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. I was alone. Just as I was about to start calling for them again, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the woods. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I backed up, my eyes frantically scanning the dark trees. Then I saw it. A figure barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it was moving slowly toward me. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of a body shrouded in darkness. I didn't wait to see more. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. My mind was screaming and my heart was pounding, but I couldn't stop. I didn't know where I was running to, just away. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, but I couldn't look back. I don't know how far I ran. I don't know how I made it back to the main road. But somehow I found myself there, trembling and out of breath, just as a car passed by. I flagged it down, and the driver, clearly startled, took me to the nearest town. I don't know what happened to my friends that night. When the authorities went back to the campsite the next morning, they found the tents torn apart, the fire still smoldering, but no sign of my friends. There were no tracks, no blood, just a deep, eerie silence that swallowed everything. I never went back to the Appalachian Mountains, and I don't think I ever will. Something in those woods, something ancient and wrong, still calls to me in my nightmares. But I know better now. Some places are meant to be left alone. It was my third week working the night shift as a paramedic in a busy city hospital, and I had yet to get used to the eerie quiet that settled in as soon as the clock struck midnight. The hospital was located in a rundown part of town, and it felt as if the entire building held its breath during those late hours. The calls we received during the night were often unpredictable, ranging from minor injuries to life or death situations, but they always seemed to be shrouded in a strange, unsettling atmosphere. On this particular night, the air felt heavier than usual. The usual hum of fluorescent lights above, the rustling of papers, and the murmurs from the nurse's station seemed distant. It was as if time had slowed down. I was assigned to the night shift with my partner, Charlie, a veteran paramedic who had seen it all. He was usually calm even when the situations were chaotic, but tonight he seemed distracted, almost like something was bothering him. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe it was just the exhaustion getting to him. Around 2:30 a.m., we received an emergency call. A woman had been found collapsed in an alleyway on the outskirts of the city, unconscious and unresponsive. The dispatcher mentioned that the woman had been missing for several days, and there were reports of strange sounds coming from the alley in the days leading up to her discovery. My heart skipped a beat at the mention of strange sounds, but I tried to brush it off. The last thing we needed was to get wrapped up in something paranormal or bizarre. We had a job to do. We rushed to the scene, navigating through narrow streets until we reached the alley. The area was dark and empty, save for the flickering street lamp at the end of the alley. I could barely make out the figure of a woman lying on the ground, pale and motionless. I felt a twinge of unease, but I pushed it down as we hurried to her side. I checked for a pulse, weak but there. She was still alive, but barely. Charlie started setting up the four, while I tried to assess the woman's condition. She appeared to have been unconscious for several days, her clothes torn and dirty. I couldn't tell if it was from some kind of struggle or if she had been left there in a daze. Her eyes were closed and her breathing was shallow. But what really unsettled me was the faint odor in the air, a strange mix of rot and something metallic. "We need to get her to the hospital now," Charlie muttered under his breath, his voice tense. As we lifted the woman into the ambulance, something strange happened. The temperature in the air seemed to drop drastically. The night, which had been uncomfortably warm just moments ago, now felt icy cold. I glanced at Charlie, but he didn't seem to notice. He was focused on the woman, trying to stabilize her. The ride to the hospital felt endless. The quiet in the ambulance was suffocating. Every little noise, the hum of the engine, the crackling of the radio, even the faint sound of our breaths, seemed amplified in the silence. I tried to focus on the woman's vitals, but my mind kept drifting. I kept thinking about the strange sounds the dispatcher had mentioned. What could have caused them? We finally arrived at the hospital, and the emergency room staff was ready. They took the woman from us, and Charlie and I stood there, watching as they rushed her inside. I felt a strange unease settle over me as I watched them work. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the strange smell or the woman's condition. It was the feeling in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the sense that we had walked into something much darker than we realized. Later that night, as we were finishing up some paperwork, we received an update about the woman. She had regained consciousness but was still disoriented. The doctors were concerned about her condition. They said she had suffered severe dehydration and malnutrition. But more troubling were the strange bruises on her skin, bruises that appeared to have been caused by something other than blunt force trauma. It was as if something had been squeezing her. And her eyes, when she looked at the doctors, her gaze was blank, almost vacant. She wouldn't speak to anyone, not even when they asked her how she ended up in the alley. The strangest part, though, came when one of the nurses mentioned something odd. The woman, despite being unconscious when we found her, had been clutching something in her hand, something small, almost like a piece of paper. The nurse had managed to pry it out of her grip after we left. When they unfolded it, the words written on it were disturbing. "Help me, they're coming." That was it. Charlie and I exchanged uneasy glances. Neither of us could explain why, but it felt as though something was horribly wrong about this whole situation. We went back to the station after our shift ended, but I couldn't stop thinking about the woman. My gut told me that something had happened to her that went beyond the ordinary. It wasn't just the physical signs of abuse or neglect. It was the feeling, the oppressive sense of something watching us, following us. 2 weeks later, I received a call from the hospital. The woman had disappeared, vanished without a trace from her bed, as if she had never been there. The room was found undisturbed, no signs of forced entry or struggle. The only thing that remained was that same smell, the same metallic scent that had lingered in the alley. They had no explanation. I tried to move on, but every time I close my eyes, I see that woman's vacant stare. I hear those strange sounds, like a low whisper in the darkness, following me, waiting for the moment when it's my turn. I don't work the night shift anymore. And I'll never forget the feeling that something or someone was watching us that night. Something that was waiting for us to come too close. It had been a while since I went camping, and when my friends suggested a weekend getaway in the mountains, I was excited. We were a group of 5, all from the same college, and though our lives had diverged in different directions after graduation, we still made time to hang out whenever we could. The plan was simple: camp in the forest, cook by the fire, share some laughs, and escape the stress of city life. We chose a remote camping site in the Cascade Range, an area well known for its breathtaking scenery but also for its eerily quiet forests. I didn't think much about the reputation of the place, just a bit of online research and some glowing reviews about how pristine and peaceful it was. None of us had any experience with real wilderness survival, but we were confident it would be an easy and relaxing weekend. The drive up was beautiful, the winding roads flanked by towering trees, and the air getting fresher as we climbed higher into the mountains. We finally reached the campsite by late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. We set up our tents, unpacked our gear, and built a small campfire. There was a sense of tranquility, almost like time had slowed down. It didn't take long for the mood to shift, though. As the night grew darker and the forest around us became silent, something felt off. At first, it was subtle, an occasional rustle in the bushes, a snap of twigs in the distance, but I chalked it up to the sounds of animals. We laughed it off, telling each other it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I remember looking at my phone at one point, hoping for a signal to check in with family, but there was nothing. No service at all. That made sense, we were deep in the woods. But the isolation only added to the creeping sense of unease. As we gathered around the fire and started telling stories, the air seemed to grow colder. My friend Mike, who was sitting closest to the edge of the camp, suddenly stiffened. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice low. We all went quiet, straining our ears. It was a distant sound, low, almost like a hum, but rhythmic, like something was moving through the trees. It was too consistent to be the wind, too deliberate to be an animal. My heart began to race, but no one else seemed as concerned as I was. "Probably just the wind," Anna, one of my friends, said, brushing it off. But the sound didn't go away. It continued, steady, persistent. And it wasn't getting any farther away. I tried to tell myself that we were just being paranoid, that it was nothing. But as the night wore on, the sound seemed to draw closer. Each time it stopped, it would start again, always in a different direction, as though it was circling our camp. We began to get nervous. Everyone except Mike and me kept trying to keep up the cheerful mood. But the tension was palpable now. We could all hear the rustling, and even the animals of the night had gone quiet. Then it happened. A sudden loud crash from somewhere in the forest nearby, a sound like a tree limb snapping under pressure. We all froze, eyes wide. Whatever was out there, it was no longer hiding. Mike was the first to act. "We need to check this out. It could be someone else out here." He grabbed a flashlight and I reluctantly followed. The others hesitated, but we insisted that they stay by the fire just in case. We moved cautiously toward the noise, our flashlights illuminating the path ahead. The moon was hidden behind the thick canopy of trees, and the darkness around us seemed to swallow the light. The forest was unnervingly silent. Then we saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods just out of the reach of our flashlight beams. It was tall, gaunt, and the silhouette of its body didn't quite seem right. It didn't move, just stood there staring at us. For a moment we froze. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Mike raised the flashlight, trying to get a better look. "Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering. But the figure didn't respond. It didn't even flinch. Without warning, it turned and began to walk deeper into the woods. It moved with a strange, jerky motion, like it wasn't quite human. We were both paralyzed with fear, unsure whether to chase it or run back to the camp. Then something worse happened. We heard the sound again, the rhythmic hum now closer than ever. And this time it was coming from multiple directions, like we were surrounded. Panic set in. "We need to go back," I whispered to Mike, but he didn't seem to hear me. We turned to head back, but the forest around us seemed different now. The trees were taller, the air heavier. It was as if the path we had just walked was no longer the same. We retraced our steps, but everything looked unfamiliar. We started running. When we finally made it back to the camp, we were breathless, our hearts pounding. We found the others huddled together, wide-eyed, staring into the woods. "What happened?" Anna asked. I tried to explain, but my words faltered. The night felt surreal. The figure, the sounds, nothing made sense. We decided to pack up and leave immediately, despite the dark and the cold. It felt as if something was following us, pressing in on us, watching our every move. As we packed our tents and gear, we could hear it again, the humming sound right behind us. It wasn't until we were back in the safety of the car, driving down the winding mountain roads, that I dared to look back. The forest, now bathed in the pale light of the car's headlights, seemed to be closing in behind us. And in the distance, just barely visible through the trees, I thought I saw the figure again, watching us from the shadows. We didn't talk much on the drive back. None of us could explain what happened that night, but we all knew one thing: we were never going camping there again. As we left the forest behind, the silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still following us, waiting for the next moment to strike. It was supposed to be a simple, uneventful drive home. I had been visiting a friend in the city for the weekend, and by the time I left, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. The highway was long, winding, and isolated, cutting through the countryside and connecting small towns like the one I lived in. I've driven this route dozens of times, and I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. But this time, everything felt different. The drive was smooth at first. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, the headlights illuminating the asphalt as I hummed along to the radio. I passed a few trucks and the occasional farmhouse, but most of the time, it was just me and the road. The stillness of the night had a strange quality, and despite the clarity of the road ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I'd glance in the rearview mirror to see the faint glow of another vehicle behind me, but it was always too far away to be concerning. About an hour into my drive, something strange happened. I saw a car on the shoulder ahead, parked with its hazard lights on. It was a newer model, black, and the driver's side door was wide open. My first thought was that maybe they had broken down, but as I approached, something about the scene didn't sit right. There were no other cars nearby, no signs of distress. The driver was nowhere to be seen, and the door hung there, slightly ajar, like it had been abandoned in a hurry. I slowed down as I passed, my eyes darting to the interior. The car was empty, no one in the driver's seat, no sign of any struggle or trouble. But something felt off. My stomach twisted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the car had been abandoned too suddenly, as though the driver had been pulled away in a panic. I forced myself to focus on the road ahead, but a strange sense of unease lingered. I glanced in my rearview mirror again and saw the same black car, still on the shoulder. At first, I thought I was just imagining things, but then I realized the car was moving. It wasn't just idling as I had originally assumed. The car had started moving slowly, as though it had just been waiting for me to pass. My heart skipped a beat. I had already driven past it. There was no way the car should be behind me now. I pressed my foot down harder on the accelerator, but the car behind me followed. No matter how fast I went, the black car stayed right behind me, maintaining an unnervingly constant distance. The headlights were blinding in my rearview mirror, and the hum of the engine was the only sound I could hear now, drowning out the soft music from the radio. Panic set in. My mind raced. Was this some sort of prank? A late-night road rage incident? Or something worse? I didn't dare slow down to check. I kept driving faster, trying to shake off the feeling of being followed, but the black car stayed with me. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and the farther I went, the more isolated I became. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their shadows heavy and oppressive in the dim light of my headlights. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The black car had no lights on. The only light it emitted was the faint glow from its own headlights, now strangely dim, almost as if they were fading. But still it followed. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned off the highway, hoping to lose the car in the side streets of a nearby town. I took several turns, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I glanced behind me again, the black car was still there, tailing me through the narrow, winding streets. The absence of headlights made it almost impossible to see where it was, but I could feel it behind me, lurking in the dark. I drove faster, my palms slick with sweat. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I couldn't see the car clearly. The shadows made it blend into the night, but I knew it was there, somewhere in the darkness. At this point, I didn't know whether it was one car or several, but the sensation of being followed was undeniable. The constant hum of the engine, the flicker of lights. Something wasn't right. Eventually, I pulled over, hoping to confront whoever was driving this strange car. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but as I did, I saw something in the corner of the mirror that made my heart stop. The black car had stopped too, just behind me, but its lights were off. There was no movement. No one got out. I couldn't see anything through the darkened windows. For a moment, everything was still. I quickly got back in my car and started to drive off, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. But as I looked back one last time, the car was gone. Vanished. No sign of it, not even the faintest outline of headlights. I continued my drive, shaking and paranoid, but I didn't see the black car again. I arrived home sometime later, still feeling like I wasn't alone, as though something, or someone, was still watching me. The next morning, I tried to look up the car online. I even called the police, but they had no reports of any incidents on that stretch of highway. It was as if the entire thing had never happened. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or who was in that car. All I know is that something about that night didn't sit right. The feeling of being followed never truly left me. I'm not sure if it was a prank, a threat, or something else, but every time I drive down that highway now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. I had booked a small cabin in the mountains through an online listing, hoping to escape the chaos of the city. The cabin was isolated, nestled deep in the forest, far away from everything. A perfect retreat for some peace and quiet. I wasn't looking for adventure, just a few days to unwind, read, and enjoy nature. But what I encountered that weekend was nothing short of terrifying. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding, the narrow road twisting through thick forests. The higher I went, the more desolate and eerie the surroundings became. There were no other houses, no signs of life, just trees and silence. I arrived just before dusk, the sun dipping behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the cabin. The place looked just like the photos, rustic, charming, and peaceful. The perfect hideaway. After settling in, I went to explore the surrounding woods. The air was crisp and everything felt still, as if the forest was holding its breath. I wandered for a while, enjoying the solitude, but there was something strange about the silence. The usual sounds of birds or rustling leaves were absent. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, and a sense of unease began to creep over me. That evening, as darkness fell, I lit a fire in the cabin's stone fireplace and settled in with a book. The crackling of the fire was comforting, but the silence of the night outside felt unnervingly loud. The only sounds I could hear were my own movements and the occasional snap of wood from the fire. I tried to push away the growing feeling that I wasn't alone, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Around 9 p.m., I heard a faint knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. I hadn't expected anyone. I wasn't expecting visitors and there were no other houses nearby. I stood still, trying to convince myself that it was just a branch tapping the window or the wind. But the knock came again, louder this time. 3 knocks, quick and sharp. I hesitated before slowly walking to the door. My first instinct was to call out, but I didn't. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening for any sound on the other side. Nothing. No voice, no footsteps. Just silence. The knock came again, more urgent this time, followed by a soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the wood. My stomach churned. I didn't open the door. Instead, I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the doorknob. What if someone was out there? A lost hiker, maybe? Or someone pretending to be in distress? My phone had no signal and I couldn't hear any vehicles on the road, so I was entirely alone. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the unease continued to grow. I turned off the lights and sat quietly in the dark, waiting. A few minutes passed, and then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be an animal. The crunch of leaves underfoot grew louder, as if someone was walking around the cabin. I had no way to escape. The only thing I could do was hide. I grabbed a flashlight and went into the small closet, hoping that whoever it was would go away. But they didn't. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin, getting closer. I could hear them right outside the window, moving slowly, deliberately, as if they were looking for something, or someone. Then everything stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally worked up the courage to leave the closet, I crept to the window, peering outside. There was no one there. No trace of anyone, nothing out of the ordinary. But that didn't make me feel safe. If anything, it made it worse. The fact that I hadn't seen anyone, but had heard the footsteps, sent my mind racing. I spent the rest of the night with all the doors and windows locked, the fire burning low in the hearth. I couldn't sleep, not with the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was out there waiting for me to let my guard down. Every creak of the wood in the cabin, every gust of wind made me jump. I didn't dare leave the cabin until morning, too afraid to step outside, even in daylight. The next day, I packed my bags and left as early as I could. I was eager to get out of there, but when I looked around at the surrounding area, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of the woods, barely visible through the trees, was a figure. A person standing completely still, staring directly at the cabin. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline of a person in the distance, motionless as if waiting for me. I didn't stop to figure out who it was. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and drove off, not looking back. As I descended the mountain road, I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just someone else visiting the area. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I had never seen that person before, and I hadn't heard or seen anyone approach the cabin during the night. When I reached the nearest town, I tried to reach the owner of the cabin, but my calls went unanswered. I later found out that the cabin had been uninhabited for years before being listed for rent. No one had been there for months, and there was no explanation for the events that had unfolded. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there that night. I still remember the feeling of being watched, the slow footsteps, and the person standing in the woods. I don't know if it was a person at all or something else entirely. All I know is that I left that cabin without ever looking back, and I'll never set foot in the mountains again. It all started on a Thursday night after a long day at work. I had just moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in downtown Seattle. The building was old, one of those places with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper that you find in the city's older neighborhoods. But it was affordable and I liked the quiet. It was my first time living alone, and though I had my doubts at first, I'd grown to enjoy the solitude. That evening, I came home around 9 p.m. I'd been working late at the office, finishing up a project, and was completely drained. The only thing I wanted was a quick dinner and then bed. I stepped inside the apartment and immediately felt the familiar comfort of being alone. No one to answer to, no distractions. The apartment was just as I had left it, dim, quiet, and still. Then I heard it. A faint sound, almost like a soft cough, coming from the kitchen. My body froze. I hadn't heard anything before entering, and I was certain I hadn't left anything on in the kitchen. I stood in the doorway, staring into the dim hall. The cough wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. My heart rate picked up. At first, I convinced myself that I was imagining it, that it was just the sound of the house settling, maybe the fridge kicking on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I took a few cautious steps forward, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The apartment felt too still, too quiet. The air felt thick with tension. I approached the kitchen slowly, careful not to make a sound. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark space ahead. When I reached the threshold, I turned the light on. The room was empty. Nothing out of the ordinary. The window above the sink was closed. The dishes were where I'd left them. But as I stood there, trying to process what had just happened, I noticed something strange. The window was open, just a crack. I definitely didn't leave it open. The evening had been cold, and I always shut the window before leaving for work in the morning. My breath quickened. I wasn't sure what to think. Maybe I'd forgotten? But no, I had a distinct memory of closing it. I stepped forward and closed the window, my fingers trembling as I turned the latch. But the unease lingered. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I checked the rest of the apartment. Bathroom, bedroom, closet, but there was nothing unusual. Everything appeared normal, but it didn't feel that way. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the creeping suspicion that someone had been in the apartment. I tried to brush it off. It had been a long day, and I was probably just overreacting. I made myself a quick dinner and ate, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every time I heard a creak from the floorboards, I tensed, waiting for something or someone to emerge from the shadows. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing strange noises from the apartment. Faint creaks, the occasional scrape against the wall, things I couldn't quite place. Every little sound felt amplified, like the building was conspiring against me. The next morning, I rushed through my usual routine, leaving the apartment in a hurry. I didn't have time to dwell on the strange feeling I'd had the night before. But when I returned that evening, something was off again. The chair in the living room, which I always pushed in neatly before I left, was pulled out slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. I hadn't left it like that. I would have noticed. I didn't want to panic, but the thought gnawed at me. Had someone been in here again? I checked the door. It was locked. The windows were closed. Nothing was missing. But still, something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. I decided to sit on the couch and try to relax, but the unease wouldn't leave. I turned on the TV, though I wasn't really watching it. Every time I heard a noise from somewhere in the apartment, I felt my heart race. And then, as if on cue, I heard it, the same cough from the night before. This time it was louder, more deliberate, and closer. I jumped up, looking around the apartment. There was no one there. The apartment was silent again. But that cough, it had come from behind me from the hallway. The same cough I had heard the previous night. And this time I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, though I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I was just being paranoid. The dispatcher told me to stay calm and wait for the officers to arrive. I locked the door, trying to stay as quiet as possible, listening for any sound that might indicate someone was still in the apartment. It wasn't long before the police arrived. They searched the place thoroughly, bathrooms, closets, under the bed, but found nothing. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone being inside. The officers were polite but dismissive, suggesting that the sounds I heard were just the building settling, and that old apartments like this one often made strange noises. But I wasn't convinced. Something about the situation didn't add up. As they left, they reassured me that everything was fine, that I was just experiencing normal anxiety from moving into a new place. The next few days were uneventful, but I never quite felt at ease. The nagging feeling that something was wrong, that someone was watching me, never went away. Then, 2 nights later, when I returned home from work, I found a small handwritten note on my doorstep. "Leave while you still can." It was short, cryptic, and chilling. I never figured out who had been in my apartment or why. Maybe I'll never know. But I couldn't stay another night. The idea of someone being in my home watching me was too much. I packed my things, called a friend to help me move, and left the apartment behind. I never looked back. To this day, I have no idea who or what had been in my home. But I do know this. Some things can't be explained, and some fears, no matter how illogical they seem, are all too real. It was a quiet night in late September, the kind of night where the air feels thick with the promise of something just out of reach. I had just returned home from a long shift at the local diner, and everything about the evening felt normal, too normal. It was just me in my 1-bedroom apartment, and I had no plans beyond a hot shower, some dinner, and sleep. I lived in a modest part of Chicago, not far from the bustling city center, but still just secluded enough to feel like I could get away from the noise of everyday life. The apartment was small, barely enough room for anything other than a bed, a couch, and a kitchen table. But I loved it. The windows overlooked a quiet alley, and the dim streetlights flickered like something out of an old film noir. It felt like a little sanctuary, my space where I could escape from everything. After a quick dinner, I went to take a shower, the hot water soothing the knots in my shoulders from the day's work. As I stepped out of the bathroom, I caught sight of myself in the mirror over the sink. The steam from the shower had clouded the glass, but I could still make out my reflection. It was strange how everything seemed more vivid in the mirror. My eyes, my face, the shadows of the room behind me. I wiped the mirror with the sleeve of my shirt, watching the condensation disappear, only to be replaced by the sharp clarity of the reflection. But as I focused, I noticed something odd. It wasn't me. For a split second, I could have sworn the reflection looked wrong. Not just the usual hazy after effect of a shower, but something deeper, something unsettling. I blinked, shook my head, and stepped back. The reflection didn't change. It was still me standing there wiping my face. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath. "It's just the steam." I took a deep breath and continued getting ready for bed. But the strange feeling lingered, as if I were being watched. The way the mirror had caught my reflection, like it was looking at something I didn't know was there, it wasn't right. I tried to shake it off and pulled on my pajamas, but as I turned to leave the bathroom, I caught another glimpse of myself in the mirror. This time I froze. The reflection was no longer just mine. It was as if something was standing just behind me, something out of place. The shape was blurry, but it was there. I could see it out of the corner of my eye, just behind my own reflection. I whipped around, my heart thumping in my chest, but there was nothing there. Only the empty bathroom, still and quiet. I looked back at the mirror. The shape was gone, but I could still feel the presence, like a shadow lingering in the corner of my vision. My heart rate increased, but I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination. The thought of the reflection didn't leave me as I went to bed. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the lingering presence of something, someone watching me. I kept thinking about that moment, that blur behind me, but I couldn't make sense of it. My apartment was quiet and I was alone. Nothing unusual ever happened here. It had to be nothing. I finally drifted into a restless sleep, but it didn't last long. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound from the bathroom, soft, almost imperceptible, like someone was moving around in there. I sat up in bed, heart hammering. The apartment was silent except for that noise. It sounded like something, or someone, was shifting. I didn't want to move, didn't want to check, but the fear of whatever was waiting in that room gnawed at me. Slowly, I got out of bed, my bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. I crept toward the bathroom, my breath shallow. The door was slightly ajar. I could feel the chill of the room seeping out, even though it had been warm when I went to sleep. I pushed the door open slowly. Nothing. The bathroom was empty. But as I stepped inside, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. I froze. This time, the reflection wasn't just blurry. It was clear as day, and it wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror was standing in the exact same position as me. But its eyes, they were different. Its eyes were dark, hollow, like something had drained all the life out of them. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. The figure smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that spread too far, its teeth too sharp, too white. I backed away slowly, my body trembling with fear. But as I moved, the figure in the mirror didn't follow me. Stayed there watching, smiling. I ran back to my room, my breath ragged, my pulse racing. I locked the bathroom door behind me, even though I knew it wouldn't help. Nothing would. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening for any sound, for anything that might indicate that I wasn't alone. But the apartment remained quiet. The next morning I was drained. My eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, my mind reeling from the events of the night before. I didn't want to go near the bathroom. I didn't want to look in the mirror again. But I had to. I had to know if it was real. I walked to the bathroom, my feet heavy with dread. When I opened the door, the mirror was completely clear, just reflecting the empty space behind me. No figure, no grin, just my own tired face. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I could still feel the cold presence lingering in the room, like something was waiting just behind the glass. I don't know how, but I knew it wasn't over. That night I moved out. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. The idea that someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to show itself, was too much. As I packed my things, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The mirror in the bathroom had been left slightly ajar, as if someone had been peering inside. And the next tenant? Well, they called me a week later. The apartment was empty, but they told me something strange. The mirror in the bathroom, it was broken, completely shattered. I didn't know if it was the same figure I saw or if it was something else, but one thing was certain. I left that apartment, but the feeling never left me. Something in that place was still waiting, and it knew I was coming. It was 11:45 p.m., and the night felt eerily quiet as I walked down the steps into the subway station. The usual rush hour crowd was long gone, and only a handful of commuters like myself were waiting for the last trains. I had just finished a late shift at the bookstore, my second job after a full day in the office, and I was exhausted. But something about that night felt different, off in a way I couldn't put my finger on. The dim, fluorescent lights flickered above me as I stood on the platform. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty station, the only other noise being the occasional rumble from the trains in the distance. I glanced at my phone. No messages, no missed calls. Just the usual notifications. I had taken this subway line dozens of times before, but tonight it felt strangely isolating. The tunnel ahead seemed darker than usual, as though the shadows in the corners were thicker. I tried to brush off the discomfort, telling myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks. But then I heard it, a soft scraping noise from behind me, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I turned around quickly, but the platform was empty. I checked both ways down the tracks, but the only sign of life was a lone figure sitting at the far end, facing the wall, their back turned toward me. They looked strange, hunched over with their arms wrapped around their knees. I couldn't see their face, and for some reason the sight made my stomach churn. The scraping noise continued, though it didn't sound like it was coming from the person at the end of the platform. I glanced back at them, but they hadn't moved. In fact, they hadn't moved at all since I first saw them. My heart began to race. I glanced at the clock. The next train was supposed to arrive in just 5 minutes, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The scraping sound stopped, and for a moment the station fell into an eerie silence. Suddenly, the train arrived with a screech and I took a deep breath, relieved to have the noise of the train fill the space. But as the train came to a stop, I saw something that froze me in place. The figure at the end of the platform had moved. I hadn't seen them stand up. They were now standing at the edge of the platform, facing me, their face still hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me, the weight of their gaze pressing into my skin. I quickly boarded the train, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. The doors closed and the train lurched forward. I glanced out the window, expecting to see the platform recede behind me, but there, standing on the edge of the tracks, was the figure. They hadn't moved an inch, just standing there, their head tilted slightly to the side. I turned away quickly, trying to focus on the inside of the train. But my heart wouldn't stop pounding. Something about the figure felt wrong. As the train sped through the dark tunnels, the overhead lights flickered again. I looked around at the other passengers. Everyone was quiet, focused on their phones or staring blankly ahead. It was as if none of them had noticed the figure, or if they had, they didn't seem disturbed by it. The train passed a few more stations and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced at my phone again and that's when I saw it. A notification from my friend, Sarah. "Hey, are you still on the train?" she asked. "I just got a weird message from you. Did you mean to send that?" Confused, I opened the message she was referring to and my blood ran cold. It was a text I didn't remember sending. It read, "Look behind you." I immediately turned around, but there was nothing behind me. Just the same quiet train, the same tired passengers. I quickly scanned my phone to check the time. Nearly an hour had passed since I boarded the train. Had I been staring out the window the whole time? Had I really not noticed how much time had gone by? I typed a quick reply to Sarah, explaining that I hadn't sent the message, and asked if she had received anything else strange. But before I could send it, the train slowed, signaling the approach of the next station. As we neared the platform, I looked out the window again. And there, standing at the edge of the tracks, was the figure. They were closer now, standing just beyond the platform. I could see more details now. Their clothes were ragged and their posture was unnaturally stiff. Their face was hidden beneath a hood, but it was clear they were staring right at me. I looked away quickly, my breath coming in short gasps. The train stopped at the station and I was nearly out of my seat before the doors even opened. I had to get off. I rushed out of the train and onto the platform, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. The station was empty. I walked quickly toward the exit, my heart still racing, trying to shake off the panic rising in my chest. But just as I was about to step into the street, I heard the scraping sound again. This time it was unmistakable. It was coming from behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. The street was empty. The shadows of the night were stretching long across the pavement, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. But someone was still there. I ran all the way home, the scraping sound echoing in my mind, and I didn't stop until I reached my apartment door. I never did find out who or what that figure was or why I received that text. But sometimes when I walk past the subway station late at night, I swear I can feel their eyes on me again, waiting in the shadows. And I can't help but wonder if I'll ever truly be alone on those platforms again. I had just finished a long day on the road, driving cross-country for work, and I was exhausted. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and the headlights of my car were the only light cutting through the pitch-black desert. I wasn't expecting to find anything fancy, but the old neon-lit motel sign by the side of the road seemed like my best option for the night. The Silver Sands Motel was one of those places you only stop at when you absolutely have to. It had that dated, worn-out look to it, the kind of place where you expect the smell of stale cigarettes to greet you as you enter. But it was clean enough, and there was a vacancy sign. After a brief exchange with the grumpy desk clerk, I got the key to room 9 and made my way down the narrow corridor, feeling the creaking floorboards beneath my feet. The room itself was small but functional. A worn-out bed, a dusty lamp, and a tiny bathroom. There was a small mirror above the sink that caught my attention as soon as I entered. It was framed in cheap gold, and the glass was slightly fogged at the edges, giving it an unsettling quality. It was the only source of reflection in the entire room, and I couldn't help but feel drawn to it. I threw my bag onto the bed, stretched out my stiff muscles, and went to wash my face in the bathroom. The dim light flickered overhead, adding to the already oppressive atmosphere. As I splashed cold water onto my face, I glanced up at the mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something in the reflection, something that wasn't there when I looked directly at it. I blinked, shaking my head. Great, just tired, I muttered to myself. Too much driving. I decided to ignore it. But as the night wore on, I began to feel uncomfortable. The small, buzzing fridge in the corner seemed to make everything feel colder, even though the room temperature was fine. The air felt thick, almost as if something was pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching me. It felt like it had a life of its own, like it was waiting for something. Around midnight, I heard a faint knocking sound coming from the wall behind the bed. My first instinct was to ignore it, probably just the wind or the plumbing. But then it came again. A soft, persistent knocking. Knock, knock, knock. I got out of bed, annoyed, and moved to the window, pulling back the dusty curtain to see if someone was messing around outside. But there was no one there. The empty desert stretched out in the darkness, just the occasional sway of the wind-blown tumbleweeds. I went back to the bed, trying to shake off the unease, but the knocking continued, now louder, closer. It wasn't coming from the wall anymore. It was coming from inside the mirror. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at it. The knocking sound was unmistakable. Knock, knock, knock. It was as though someone was tapping on the glass from the other side, trying to get out. I backed away from the mirror, my heart racing. The room felt colder now, the air thick with a strange tension. My legs refused to move. I was frozen. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the mirror. And then it happened. The reflection in the mirror began to distort. The figure I saw wasn't mine anymore. It was someone else's. A shadowy figure, dark and formless, seemed to move across the glass. I gasped and took a step back. The figure's face was obscured, but I could see the outline of a person, someone dressed in tattered clothes. They were standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the empty, dreary motel room. My heart was hammering in my chest. I grabbed my bag, ready to leave. But as I reached for the door, I glanced once more at the mirror. The figure was still there, standing behind me, its face now visible, twisted, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. I felt my blood run cold. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My legs refused to move. Then, something in the reflection began to change. The figure moved. It reached its hand out from the mirror, pressing against the glass. A low growl emanated from the depths of the reflection, and I could hear a voice, low, raspy, whispering something incomprehensible. It was coming from the mirror. In a flash of panic, I turned and bolted for the door, slamming it open. But as I stepped into the hallway, I felt something cold brush against my neck. A hand? I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. The motel was silent. I glanced back at room 9's door. Suddenly the air around me felt colder, the hallway darker. The mirror's reflection had taken something from the room. I was certain of it. I ran down the hallway, my feet pounding the floor, heart racing in terror. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and even then I didn't feel safe. The mirrors in my rearview mirror seemed to watch me, and I swear I saw a faint figure standing behind me in the reflection. I drove for hours that night. The image of that twisted face burned into my mind. When I passed a gas station at dawn, I couldn't resist looking in the car's side mirror. And there, staring back at me, was the same hollow-eyed figure, grinning at me from the glass. I haven't been able to look at any mirrors the same way since. It was one of those nights when everything felt strangely still, as if the world had stopped spinning for a moment. I just moved into a new apartment in downtown Seattle. Nothing too fancy, just a small one-bedroom on the 5th floor of an aging building. It was a Tuesday evening around 11 p.m. when I decided to finish unpacking the last of the boxes. The apartment had a view of the city, but the streetlights below barely reached up to my window. It felt like I was enclosed in a bubble, isolated from the world. The only sounds were the hum of my refrigerator and the occasional car passing by on the wet streets outside. I was used to silence. Living alone had taught me to embrace it. But that night, something about the stillness felt different. My phone rang while I was putting away some books on the shelf. It was a local number I didn't recognize, but I picked up anyway. Maybe it was the building's maintenance team or a wrong number. I didn't expect it to change everything. "Hello?" I answered, my voice slightly shaky from the sudden interruption. But there was no response. Nothing but a faint, static-filled silence on the other end. I waited, wondering if someone had accidentally dialed the wrong number. But then I heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like breathing. Slow, deliberate, and disturbingly close to the phone's microphone. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" I repeated, a little louder this time. But still no answer. Only the unsettling sound of breathing. I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at the screen. The call hadn't disconnected, yet the timer hadn't moved either. It was stuck at 0, as if time itself had frozen. I stared at the screen for a moment longer, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then suddenly I heard a faint, echoing sound, a knock. A slow, deliberate knock. The sound seemed to come from somewhere inside the apartment, but it wasn't from the door. It was from behind the walls. Knock, knock, knock. My breath caught in my throat and I glanced nervously around the room. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things or if something was actually there. The knocking continued, each thud echoing in my ears. I hung up the phone, but the sensation of being watched didn't go away. The silence returned, but it was thick and heavy, as if it had a weight to it. I decided to check the apartment, just to reassure myself that nothing was out of place. I opened the door to the bedroom, turned on the lights, and scanned the room. Nothing seemed unusual. The closet door was slightly ajar, and the blinds were drawn shut, but nothing that would explain the strange noise. I walked into the hallway, feeling a sense of unease creeping up my spine. The knocking had stopped, but the silence felt heavier now. I stood in the center of the hallway, listening, trying to hear anything that might explain what was going on. I was about to turn back when my phone rang again. The same local number. My hands shook slightly as I answered, holding the phone close to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice now laced with panic. Once again, no answer. Just that faint, steady breathing. But this time it was different. There was something else, something subtle yet unmistakable. A voice, barely audible, whispered so quietly I could barely make it out. "Behind you." I froze. I slowly turned around, my eyes darting around the hallway. Nothing was there. I strained my ears, hoping to hear something, anything. The apartment felt unnervingly empty. I took a step back, my eyes now glued to the darkened hallway. The knocking resumed, but it wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from inside my apartment. It sounded like it was coming from the other side of the door. Knock, knock, knock. I rushed to the door, my pulse racing, and threw it open, expecting to find someone standing there, someone messing with me. But the hallway was empty. The only thing that greeted me was a cold, bitter draft, the sound of my own breathing echoing in the silence. My heart pounded in my chest. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed my phone again, dialing 911 in a panic, but just before I hit the call button, I heard it. The phone had gone silent once more, but a message popped up on the screen. "You shouldn't have ignored me." The words sent a chill down my spine. Without thinking, I hung up the phone and turned on the TV, hoping the noise would drown out the growing sense of dread that was creeping up on me. but nothing could quiet the sound of footsteps, soft but distinct, coming from just outside my door. Step, step, step. I didn't dare open the door again. Instead, I huddled on the couch, phone in hand, feeling trapped. The footsteps stopped. The knocking stopped. And then the phone rang again. This time I couldn't resist. I answered. The line was eerily silent. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint scraping noise, like something, or someone, dragging their fingers across the glass of my front window. I stood up and moved toward the window, slowly, cautiously. I couldn't see anything outside. But then a shadow appeared on the other side, the faint outline of someone standing there, pressing their face against the glass. I stepped back in horror, but when I looked again, the shadow was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, but the dread lingered in my bones. I didn't leave my apartment that night. The next morning, I called the building manager to ask if anyone else had experienced anything strange. She said no, but when I mentioned the phone calls, she paused for a moment before telling me something that made my blood run cold. That number, she said quietly, was disconnected 3 months ago. I haven't heard from the caller since, but every time my phone rings with an unfamiliar number, my heart stops. I'm not sure who or what it was, but I'm certain of one thing. It's still watching me, and it's waiting for me to pick up the phone again. It was a rainy Friday evening in November when I moved into my new rental house in the outskirts of Portland. I was fresh out of college, looking for a quiet place to start my adult life. The house, an old Victorian-style building, was charming in its own way. It had that slightly weathered, lived-in look, with creaky wooden floors and antique furniture that made the place feel like it had a history. But the price was right, and it had a basement, which was perfect for my work-from-home setup. After a long day of unpacking and settling in, I decided to relax with a cup of tea and start organizing the basement. The landlord had assured me that everything was in good condition, but when I opened the door to the basement, I was immediately hit with a strange, musty smell. It felt colder than the rest of the house, like it was holding onto a secret. I turned on the light and made my way down the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The basement was large, with exposed brick walls and shelves filled with old boxes and furniture covered in dusty sheets. There was a faint hum of old pipes running through the walls, but other than that, the place was eerily quiet. I was going through some of the boxes when I heard it, a soft, distant sound like someone whispering. I paused, my hands frozen mid-air, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then it came again, louder this time, like a muffled voice calling my name. James? I shivered. Nobody was supposed to be in the house, and the sound didn't seem like it was coming from the walls or pipes. It was as if someone was right behind me, whispering in my ear. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was in the basement. I was alone. James? The whisper was louder now, more insistent. I felt a cold rush of fear crawl up my spine. I scanned the room, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing out of place, just old furniture and boxes and the faint hum of the pipes. But the voice, it seemed closer now, like it was echoing off the walls. I hurried back up the stairs, closing the basement door behind me. I leaned against the door for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like something wasn't right. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I heard a creak or a rustle from the basement, my heart would race. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Old houses made noises, right? But I couldn't shake the voice. The whispering voice that seemed to be calling my name. The next morning, I decided to go down to the basement again, determined to face whatever was making those noises. Maybe there was something in the walls, a rodent or some kind of animal. But when I opened the basement door, I was greeted with an unsettling sight. There, on the floor in the center of the room, was a large, dark stain. It looked like someone had spilled something, but it was too thick, too unnatural to be just a spilled drink. It was almost like fresh blood, though I couldn't tell for sure. I hesitated, my hand gripping the door frame, but something made me walk closer. The stain wasn't just on the floor. It seemed to trail toward the far corner of the room, leading to an old cabinet that I hadn't noticed the day before. The cabinet's door was slightly ajar, revealing a dark space inside. My instinct told me not to open it, but I was drawn to it. I took a deep breath and reached out, pulling the door open. Inside I found an old, dusty chest. It was locked, but the lock was rusted and it gave way easily. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside the chest, there was a pile of old newspapers, photographs, and a small leather-bound journal. I picked up the journal, flipping through the pages. It was written in neat, careful handwriting, but the further I read, the more disturbed I became. The entries spoke of strange noises, voices in the walls, and a sense of being watched. The last few entries were incomprehensible, filled with ramblings about the voice that called the author's name and how it wouldn't stop. And then at the very end, one last line, "It will come for you too." Just like it came for me. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I closed the journal, the whispers from earlier still echoing in my mind. I hurriedly put the journal back into the chest and shut it. Just as I was about to leave the basement, I heard it again, the voice, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, more distinct, coming from the far corner of the room. "James?" I froze, heart racing. The voice sounded exactly like mine. It was then that I noticed it, the reflection of myself in the basement's small, cracked mirror. But it wasn't me. Not completely. It was a distorted version of myself, grinning, its eyes hollow and dark. I turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My mind was racing, the journal's words playing over and over in my head. I didn't stay in the house after that. The landlord never responded to my calls, and the neighbors didn't seem to know anything about the place. But I'll never forget the way the voice sounded. It wasn't just a whisper, it was something that knew me, something that had been waiting for me. And I'm sure it's still down there in the basement, waiting for the next person to open that door. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, a quiet night at home after a long week of work, but it quickly became something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I still don't know what happened that night. I wish I could explain it, but I can't. It was just me, my apartment, and a locked room that I'd never paid much attention to. And then, the curse. I had moved into the apartment a few months earlier, a charming one-bedroom in a building near the edge of the city. It wasn't the most luxurious place, but it was affordable, and the location was perfect for my commute. The apartment had a strange layout, though. There was a small room in the back, wedged between the kitchen and the bathroom. The door to the room had no handle, just a rusted wooden door with a strange lock. I had assumed it was some sort of storage room, perhaps once used by the building's former tenants. I'd always thought about opening it, but I never did. Something about the door unsettled me. It wasn't just the lock, it was the way the door looked, like it had been untouched for decades. So, it became the one part of the apartment I just ignored. That was until one night. I had returned home from work around 7 p.m., tired after a long day. The first thing I did was grab a bottle of wine and put on my favorite Netflix show. After a while, the wine kicked in and I started to feel a little too relaxed. The sounds of the city outside my window were muffled by the thick walls of the building, and soon, everything felt too quiet, almost oppressive. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from the direction of the locked room. At first, I dismissed it. The building was old. It could have been the wind, the pipes, or the settling of the floorboards. But then it came again, a series of faint knocks as though someone was tapping gently on the other side of the door. My heart skipped a beat and my mind began to race. I stood up and walked to the door, my footsteps echoing through the quiet apartment. My fingers hovered over the lock. I told myself I was being ridiculous. There was nothing there. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't open the door that night. Instead, I convinced myself I had just imagined it. The tapping never came again, and I went to bed, though I couldn't quite shake the unease that clung to me. The next few days were normal. Work, dinner, Netflix, and then sleep. I tried to put the tapping out of my mind. But each time I passed that locked door, the curiosity grew. Something about that room, that sound, kept pulling me back. I had to know what was inside. Then, on the fourth night after hearing the tapping, it happened again. But this time it wasn't a soft tap. It was a violent banging, a harsh thud that rattled the door. I nearly dropped my wine glass, the sound so sudden and jarring. The entire apartment seemed to vibrate with it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the rusty old key I found in the drawer, a key I had never used, jamming it into the lock. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a small, dark room. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the scent of mildew. It was barely furnished, just an old rocking chair in the middle of the room, facing a small window that looked out over an alley. But it wasn't the room itself that made my blood run cold. On the floor, in the center of the room, was something that hadn't been there before. A circle had been drawn on the floor in what looked like charcoal, and inside it were strange symbols. Symbols I didn't recognize, but that felt wrong somehow. The room was thick with an oppressive, almost suffocating atmosphere. It felt as if something had been waiting for me, as if this room had been expecting my arrival. I backed away from the doorway, heart pounding in my chest. I tried to close the door, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of scratching, like nails against wood, echoed from inside. I quickly shoved the door shut and locked it, my mind spinning with confusion and terror. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The sound of scratching continued, growing louder, more frantic. It seemed to come from inside the walls, from the very room I had just locked away. My phone buzzed on the table, a text from a friend asking if I was okay. I had no idea what to say. How could I explain this? How could I explain the feeling that something was watching me, something I couldn't see but could almost feel breathing down my neck? The next morning, the door was closed as if nothing had happened. The symbols on the floor were gone, erased by some invisible hand. The air felt lighter, but the terror I had experienced lingered, thick in my chest. I called the building manager, but when I told him about the locked room and the strange occurrences, he acted like I was crazy. He said that room had always been a storage closet, that no one had ever reported anything odd. He assured me I was just stressed, that I should try to relax. But I couldn't. The tapping continued that night and the night after that. Each time I heard it, I felt the same oppressive weight pressing down on me. And each time I found the room locked, as though nothing had ever happened. The symbols never returned, but the feeling of something watching, waiting, remained. I eventually moved out. I couldn't stay there anymore. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that the room is still there, locked away, just waiting for someone else to open it. I never learned what the symbols meant, or who, or what had been in that room. But I know one thing. Whatever it was, it wasn't finished with me. I think it's still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next person to make the mistake I made. And that's the curse of the locked room. Once you open it, it never really lets you go. I've never been someone who believes in the supernatural or in things that go bump in the night. But the events of that summer completely shattered my rational view of the world. What happened to me was so bizarre, so unnerving, that to this day I still can't explain it. All I know is that it all started with a job I took at a remote surveillance station, in a place so far from civilization that the silence was deafening. It was a summer job, a break from my studies, and an opportunity to earn some extra money. I had no idea what I was getting into when I signed up to work as a night shift security monitor for a company overseeing remote properties in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. The place was cut off from the rest of the world, miles away from the nearest town and surrounded by thick, dense forests. The only company I would have were a few cameras set up in key areas of the property, and the occasional check-in from the boss. It sounded easy enough. but I quickly learned that some things are too strange to be ignored. The station was a small, prefabricated building with a single room filled with monitors, computers, and equipment to monitor the various surveillance cameras around the property. The first few days were uneventful. I spent hours staring at the screens, monitoring the cameras in various parts of the land. Everything was quiet, too quiet. The cameras covered the main trail that led up to the station, the forest perimeter, and a few other spots on the property, but no one ever came by. I didn't even see animals passing through, which I found strange considering the dense wildlife in the area. The first sign that something was off came one evening when I noticed something unusual on one of the screens. The camera monitoring the forest trail suddenly flickered. It wasn't a glitch or an electrical fault, it was a clear, unmistakable image. I could see someone walking down the path, moving slowly as though they were aware they were being watched. The problem was I hadn't seen anyone come by. The path was supposed to be empty. I quickly checked the other cameras, but the other areas were clear. The person on the trail was alone. I tried calling my boss, but he was unreachable. His phone went straight to voicemail. I wasn't sure whether to panic or write it off as a mistake, but I kept watching, unable to take my eyes off the monitor. Then the person stopped and turned toward the camera. I froze. For a split second, the figure on the screen just stood there, staring directly into the camera. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette of a person dressed in dark clothes. I felt a chill run down my spine. I was miles away from the nearest neighbor. There was no one out here except for me. The figure didn't move, and after a few seconds, they simply turned around and continued walking down the path, disappearing from view. I watched the screen for what felt like an eternity, unsure of what I just witnessed. I told myself it was probably a trick of the light or perhaps even a reflection from the camera's lens. But that explanation didn't make sense, not with the clarity of the image I had just seen. The next night the same thing happened. This time I could see the figure more clearly, a man tall with a dark hood. He walked slowly down the trail and paused exactly in front of the camera, as if waiting for it to focus. When I checked the other cameras again, everything else was still. No other movements in sight. Just that one person. I tried again to contact my boss, but this time, I heard nothing but static on the phone line. The station felt eerily empty, with only the hum of the computers for company. I spent the rest of my shift in a tense stupor, eyes glued to the monitors, expecting something to happen. But nothing did. The situation escalated a few days later. The figure reappeared on the camera. This time, not just once, but several times throughout the night. I could see him moving along the perimeter of the property, always staying just out of clear view of the cameras, as if he knew exactly where to go to avoid being caught. I tried adjusting the angles of the cameras to get a better view, but he was always one step ahead. One evening, as I watched the screens, I noticed something even more disturbing. The person wasn't alone anymore. In the dead of night, I saw two figures on the trail, walking in sync with each other, their movements deliberate and almost coordinated. The figures never stepped into the camera's direct view, but I could see them moving through the edges of the screen. As they got closer to the station, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. There was something off about the way they moved. I was paralyzed with fear but couldn't look away. I quickly checked the perimeter cameras again, but the figures weren't there. It was as if they had disappeared completely. My heart was pounding and my palms were sweating. I scanned the forest with the zoom function on the camera, but there was no sign of anything. No footprints, no shadows. Just empty space. Then the final incident happened. The last thing I saw on the screen was a face. A pale, gaunt face pressed directly against the camera lens. I screamed and jumped back from my chair, my heart racing. The face lingered for a second before disappearing. I immediately locked the doors of the station and called the police. They arrived in the early hours of the morning, but by then, everything was quiet. The cameras were still running, but there was no sign of anyone. No tracks, no evidence that anyone had been there. The police said they'd investigate further, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. They didn't understand the terror that had gripped me. I left the station shortly after that night and never returned. The entire experience felt unreal, like something out of a nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. I saw it and I still can't explain it. I don't know who or what was watching me from those cameras, but I know I'll never look at surveillance footage the same way again. It's strange how we can go months, even years, living side by side with strangers and never truly know what's behind the doors of the apartments next to ours. I always thought my building was quiet. I never had any issues with the neighbors. That is, until I met the one who lived just down the hall from me. I'd recently moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a mid-sized building located in the heart of Buffalo, New York. It was a relatively peaceful neighborhood. Quiet, not too much traffic, and a sense of normalcy that you can only get from suburban life. My job in marketing kept me busy during the week, and I often found myself buried in emails and phone calls when I got home. But something changed about a month after I moved in. It started with small, seemingly insignificant things. At first, it was just the strange noises coming from the apartment next door. Around midnight every night, I would hear soft thuds like someone was pacing back and forth. At first, I brushed it off as the building settling or maybe the sound of furniture being moved. It was an old building after all. The walls were thin and it wasn't uncommon for sounds to carry. Then the tapping started. A quiet, rhythmic tapping against the wall that separated my apartment from the one next door. It wasn't loud, but it was consistent. Always at the same time, right around midnight. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to sleep through. The sound would go on for hours, until I would finally fall into an uneasy, restless slumber. I decided to speak to my neighbor. I mean, how could it be anything else but a simple misunderstanding? I knocked on his door one evening, preparing myself for a polite exchange. The door opened, and a man I hadn't seen before stood in front of me. His name was Greg, he told me, and he was in his late 30s. He looked perfectly normal, almost overly polite, but there was something about him that felt off. His eyes were too still, and there was an uncomfortable tension in his posture. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm hearing some noise coming from your apartment late at night," I said. "It sounds like tapping on the wall." His expression didn't change. There was no sign of surprise, no apology. He just stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment. "I don't hear anything," he finally said in a quiet voice, "but I'll be sure to keep it down." His response wasn't quite what I was expecting. I mean, I didn't think he would admit to making noise, but I had hoped for some acknowledgement. Instead, there was only that same unnerving calm. I nodded and turned to leave, but then I heard him say, "If it bothers you again, just let me know." I wasn't convinced. Something about Greg felt off. I couldn't place it, but I had the distinct feeling that he was hiding something. Over the next few nights, the tapping continued. It was subtle, yet persistent. I tried to block it out, but I couldn't. I even tried earplugs, but they didn't help. That's when things started to get strange. One night, as I was lying in bed, the tapping started again. But this time it wasn't just tapping. It was a rhythmic sound, like a fingernail scraping against the wall. The noise was louder now, sharper, almost like a deliberate attempt to get my attention. My heart began to race and I grabbed my phone to check the time. It was 2 a.m. And then I heard something even more disturbing. A voice. A faint whisper, barely audible, but it was coming from the direction of Greg's apartment. It was a low, guttural sound, like someone was speaking to themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was strange, almost mechanical, as if repeating something over and over. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and went to his door, heart pounding in my chest. This time I didn't knock. I opened the door and to my surprise it was unlocked. Inside, the apartment was dark. There was no sign of Greg. I stepped in cautiously, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The place was clean, too clean, sterile almost. The walls were bare, no decorations or personal items anywhere. But what caught my eye was the room at the back where I could see a faint light flickering under the door. I approached slowly, my breath shallow, and turned the handle. The door opened with a creak, and that's when I saw it. Greg was sitting in the corner of the room, staring at the wall. His face was pale, his eyes wide open, unblinking. His fingers were tapping on the wall in front of him, moving rhythmically as if in some kind of trance. His lips were moving too, but there were no words, just incomprehensible sounds like a chant. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away. The door slammed shut behind me. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what I had just witnessed. The next morning, I woke up to find that Greg's apartment was eerily quiet. The tapping had stopped. I knocked on his door again, but this time no one answered. I waited for hours, but still nothing. I called the building management, but when they went to check, they found nothing. Greg had disappeared. No sign of him anywhere, no explanation, no trace. The strangest part? When I checked the wall where Greg had been sitting, there were marks, long, deep grooves like fingernails had been scraping against it for days, maybe even weeks. I moved out a few weeks later, unable to shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I don't know what Greg was doing or who or what he was communicating with, but I know I won't be going back to that building. Some doors are better left unopened. Some people better left forgotten. Alright, that's all the stories for today. I'm so glad you stayed with me until the end. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.